Titanfall, released in 2014, marks an interesting point in modern gaming because the game is multiplayer only. Previous big-budget, full-price shooters such as Call of Duty and Battlefield had a separate offline, linear single-player campaign and the ever-present multiplayer mode. Titanfall broke this convention and instead tried to incorporate the story into the multiplayer, which went on to become one of the game's main criticisms. Stuart Andrews, writing for Trusted Reviews, said that the game contains a dull narrative and a failed attempt to make a multiplayer shooter feel like a single-player campaign. Hollander Cooper makes similar remarks in his review on Games Radar, saying that the story was such that your battles felt meaningless. Despite this, multiplayer-only games have become more common, with games such as Overwatch, Destiny, and Counter-Strike enjoying critical and commercial success, with some people still feeling that these releases should have a separate campaign. So, today on Games of Reference, we shall be answering the question, should multiplayer games have an offline campaign? For the sake of easily organising this debate, we shall be looking at each side in turn, giving 3 key arguments in favour of an offline campaign, the pro side, and 3 against the concept, the anti side. So, let's begin with pro argument 1, a lack of content. This argument mainly applies to a wave of big budget shooters we've seen crop up over the last few years, such as Star Wars Battlefront and the aforementioned Titanfall. We're looking at many other games in this genre, such as the 2 industry giants Call of Duty and Battlefield. We can see that they have a single player campaign and a multiplayer mode. For many players, this gives them variety in the game, meaning that they can either play a structured story or a frantic multiplayer deathmatch depending on their mood. The campaign also gives the player context to the battles which occur within the multiplayer, allowing them to recognise why the 2 sides are fighting, which we saw was the main criticism with Titanfall. However, games such as Battlefront lack this quality. The campaign mode isn't present, which would be acceptable if there was some tweaking to the formula of a multiplayer shooter. The majority though retain the standard leveling and unlocking systems from other multiplayer shooters, often with less content. This leads many players to feel as if some content is missing, making the whole product feel less substantial, a major problem for games that cost over £40 or $60. However, campaign modes aren't just there for the sake of having extra content, they tell a story, which leads us to pro argument 2, delivering a power fantasy narrative. As video games are an interactive medium, many developers want to provide the player with as big a sense of accomplishment as possible. As part of this, many developers will often make the game's narrative revolve around the player character to a large degree. In shooters, this means giving the player access to various forms of technology to kill the enemy, a technique especially prevalent in the Call of Duty series. Whereas in fantasy games, the player will often be the chosen one, a character with special abilities that affect the gameplay and the narrative, such as the Dragonborn character from Skyrim. These are just a few examples of how a game's narrative can deliver on the power fantasy which is so prevalent in gaming. However, it can be very difficult to deliver this kind of narrative in a multiplayer game, because the player is very aware that many other people will be going through the exact same story at the same time. In the worst case scenario, a player may even see other players going to activate a quest as part of this chosen one narrative, causing an odd inconsistency in the game's fiction, taking the player out of the experience. While it is possible to deliver a more team-based multiplayer narrative, thus negating this issue, doing so would require a larger emphasis to be put on the structured story of a game. Since many multiplayer games tend to be light on story, this sort of narrative is unlikely to succeed, meaning that a campaign may be better for any multiplayer game wishing to deliver a complete power fantasy narrative based on individual glory. Campaigns, however, can also serve another key purpose for the player, which leads us to pro argument 3, learning via the campaign. If a player hasn't had time to learn the mechanics of a game, then being dropped into a hectic multiplayer match can be quite overwhelming, as they haven't had time to learn any advanced techniques, so they can't access the depth of mechanics a multiplayer mode may offer. This will often lead to a few miserable hours of a player being killed repeatedly by those more experienced, which a designer may wish to avoid. Campaigns offer a remedy to this problem, with campaigns for many modern games being at least a few hours long, much longer in many cases. They allow the player to gradually learn the game's mechanics, thus building up their confidence before they're dropped into an unfamiliar challenge. That challenge in this case being the multiplayer. But while this argument seems solid, it also leads to a rebuttal from the other side to this discussion. Anti-argument 1, multiplayer tutorials and learning via play. A player can build up confidence with mechanics in various ways, not just through a campaign. A simple and common method in many multiplayer games is to put a player through a short tutorial that teaches them the basics before they join their first game, sometimes complemented by some collaborative missions in which some less experienced players can work towards a common goal. Both of these give the player a space where failure doesn't necessarily matter as much as in a multiplayer match, as there normally isn't a competitive element present in these systems. But what about when a player joins the main game for the first time? What's still stopping an expert player from stomping all over new players? Well, there's a solution that many games use: a ranking system. These kind of systems segment players based on their performance, determined by how well they generally do in a match. This allows players to move up or down ranks after they win or lose so many matches. This largely prevents the issue of experts being matched up with less experienced players, as the game will automatically place players with roughly equal skill with each other and allow the player's skill to naturally grow as they play, which will then be reflected in their rank and their peers. Counter-Strike is perhaps one of the most famous games to employ such a system. However, some people, while appreciating competitive multiplayer, will still want a more structured system of play, which leads us to Anti-Argument 2, multiplayer campaigns. While we can make the distinction between multiplayer games that include a single player campaign and those which don't, how about those games which have a multiplayer campaign? This can be done, and one way to do this is to provide a player with a cooperative campaign similar to those collaborative missions mentioned in the last point, but with a stronger emphasis on narrative. An example of this style is Destiny, which has separate co-op and competitive modes, instead of limiting its campaign to single player. This can serve the lengthened tutorial view of campaigns which was put forward in Pro Argument 3, while also having the bonus of adding some competitive elements, such as recording certain statistics and displaying at the end of a mission in which player did best. As well as this, if a developer wants to deliver a multi-character narrative, or to emphasize teamwork, this could be a way to achieve such an effect. But crafting a campaign can be a lengthy and costly affair, which leads to today's final argument, Anti-Argument 3, developer resources. Many developers may not want to make a campaign for a myriad of differing reasons. Making a campaign means that time and money which could be spent on the multiplayer instead needs to be put into the campaign. This means that a developer focusing solely on multiplayer can put all their resources into polishing and testing the multiplayer mechanics to make the game as fun as possible, while possibly providing players with more maps, weapons and such than otherwise. As well as this, making both a campaign and multiplayer puts more pressure on staff to create and develop for both. While this isn't generally a problem for large developers who may employ hundreds of people, a small indie dev consisting of a small group of people, possibly a single person, may not be able to deal with making both modes. An indie dev, or any developer for that matter, will only have a limited budget to work on, so trying to stretch that budget into making a decent campaign and multiplayer mode can be impossible, and it may potentially be outside the scope of the game they want to make. In this case, adding a campaign may reduce the overall quality of the product. So, should multiplayer games include campaigns? Like most questions asked on this show, the answer is not a straight yes or no. A single player campaign can be a powerful tool in constructing a power fantasy narrative, emphasizing individual glory, also giving a space for a player to learn the game's mechanics and potentially give the player more content to play through. Despite this, developers' resources may be better spent on polishing the multiplayer rather than crafting a campaign that may be outside of the developer's scope in the first place, or also allowing the player to learn more naturally through regular multiplayer play. In conclusion, while a campaign can make for a fantastic gameplay experience that a multiplayer mode may not be able to provide, not every multiplayer game can be expected to have a campaign, because doing so may stretch manpower and resources beyond what a developer can do. A campaign, like any other device in video game development, is a tool, one which can be used to great effect, but whether it's right to use one comes down to the developer and what kind of game they want to make. Thanks for watching Games of Reference. Do you think multiplayer games need a separate campaign and multiplayer mode? Leave that and anything else in the comments below, and consider subscribing and clicking the links on the screen for more informative gaming content. But until then, see you in the next video.